So I'm Ed Nersessian, I'm director of the center, and I'd like to welcome you to this meeting on what mathematics can tell us about the mind and the brain. The idea for this roundtable was generated during a dinner conversation with Sylvain Capel, who's head of the Mathematics Institute at NYU, and Charles Marmor, who's a psychiatrist and chairman of the department at NYU. So they thought that this would be a very timely subject for us to have a roundtable about at the Helix Center, and I want to thank them for it. Just briefly, we have a number of programs set up already for the fall, and I'd like to mention them. I think the first one after this is a program on why economists disagree, which will be on October 13th. And we'll have economists from the two sides of the intellectual or scientific areas discussing it. The following day on Sunday, and is it at 2:30? We will have a program called Poetry and Jazz, where we have a poet and a jazz musician who will play, recite, and discuss the relationship between poetry and jazz. Following that, in October, over a Friday and a Saturday, we'll have two roundtables. One of them is going to be on, I wrote the exact title somewhere, Life and Movement, and the other would be on male-male competition, globalization, war, and violence. These two roundtables have been organized and proposed by Maxine Schitz-Johnson, who's an emeritus professor of philosophy of science from Oregon University, and who was here during the Philoctetes days and did 2 or 3 programs for us. So our website is up, and one of the ideas that has always propelled us is that these roundtables should not just end here, but there should be an ongoing conversation taking place after that, afterwards. And we were not set up before for it, and I think we are. And maybe Rob can say what you do for that.
Yes, thank you, Ed. First of all, go to www.thehelixcenter.org or helixcenter.org, and that will access the website. And there's a link to sign up, after which you can participate in conversations on the website. You can either join a topic, a question that has already been posed by someone else related to one of the events here, or you can propose a new subject for discussion. The other thing is that if you want to comment on anything that's going on here, you can Twitter at the Helix Center. Okay.
So as I said, today's subject has a very easy title, but it is a rather complicated subject. And we have people who I think can discuss it, who are leaders in this field. I will start with Ned Block, who's been to us a number of times. He's the Silver Professor of Philosophy, Psychology, and Neuroscience at NYU. He came to NYU from MIT, where he was chair of the philosophy program there. He works in philosophy of mind and foundations of neuroscience and cognitive science. Bard Ermentrout, who is unfortunately unable to be here today, but he's with us via Skype, is Distinguished University Professor of Computational Biology and Professor of Mathematics at the University of Pittsburgh. He's written more than 200 papers in math, philosophy, physics, and math, biology, physics, and neuroscience. And He has a software called XPPAUT for the simulation of and analysis of dynamical systems, and has written a number of books, and one of them is available here for you if you would like to purchase it. Ken Miller is professor, Department of Neuroscience, Department of Physiology, and Center for Theoretical Neurobiology at Columbia University. He's co-director of the Schwartz program in Theoretical Neurobiology and its Center of Theoretical Neuroscience. Is also co-director of its Neurobiology and Behavior graduate program. He serves as vice chair of the Department of Neuroscience. He's the founding editor of the Journal of Computational Neuroscience, recipient of the Alfred P. Sloan Research Fellowship, Searle Scholars Award, Dell Web Biology Fellowship, National Science Foundation Graduate Fellowship, and author of many articles. All of the people have books, and you can see them after the meeting. George Reeke Jr. is associate professor with tenure and head of the Laboratory of Biological Modeling at the Rockefeller University and the senior fellow of the Neurosciences Institute. He developed the first microprocessor-controlled lab instruments, an X-ray camera, and his Fourier synthesis software was used to solve many protein structures worldwide. Beginning in the 70s, his interest has turned to problems of pattern recognition, perceptual categorization, and motor control, which he studies primarily through computer simulations of relevant neuronal systems. Xiao-Jing Wang, am I pronouncing it wrong? Is professor of neurobiology, adjunct professor of physics, applied mathematics, and psychology, director of the Schwartz program in theoretical neuroscience at the Yale University. He's a theoretical neuroscientist studying executive and cognitive function, whose group has pioneered neural circuit models of the prefrontal cortex, discovering a specific neural circuit mechanism for decision making. He's also studying, I believe, schizophrenia. Yeah. Dr. Wang was a recipient of the Alfred P. Sloan Fellow, National Science Foundation Career Award, and John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation Fellow. Is that it? Okay. So that's it, and we can get going.
Probably a very naive scientist's point of view, which I'm sure the philosophers will correct me, but essentially the mind comes from the brain, and the brain is part of the natural world, and mathematics describes the natural world. Mathematics was developed, or at least a lot of mathematics was developed in the study of physics, of the trajectories of moving objects, and how collections of objects, new properties emerge at a higher level. And in essence, studying the mind by studying the brain is no different. We're studying a physical system that has many, many levels, many interacting parts at each level, leading to new phenomena at the next level, and at the next, from the molecules to the cells to the circuits and the circuit behavior to ultimately to the animal's behavior. And what we use math for is to understand how these interacting pieces produce the phenomena that we see. And in particular, I think one of the biggest things that we do is we're studying things at one level, like we have a lot of cells connected with some circuitry, and they have some functional responses. Say I study visual cortex, and so as a visual image comes in, the neurons have certain responses to the visual world, which have been well studied. But how do those responses, with all of their details and complexity, emerge out of the circuit? What are the circuit motifs that, the interactions between the cells that lead to this behavior emerging? And then, so these multi-level, one behavior at one level emerging from another level, from interaction of many things at another level, is sort of the essence of what we try to understand as we try to understand the brain. And ultimately, all the elements of our minds are things that we would like to identify as emergent properties of what neurons do in the same sense. And so mathematics is a tool of taking objects that you might say are blindly interacting. They're interacting according to some rules. The rules might have some intelligence, but they're interacting according to some rules and understanding what emerges out of them. And that's so to the extent to which the mind is an emanation of the natural physical world, mathematics is a way to understand what happens there.
Could I go on from what you said, because it's a perfect introduction, I think. I'd like to make a distinction that I would like the audience to go home with between math as a tool for studying the brain, which involves both statistics, physics and chemistry, as you've pointed out, how we use computers to simulate what goes on with neurons, with ions in the brain, with with blood flow and all of these things. And on the other hand, the question of whether mathematics should have a role in our theories about cognition and things at a higher level, like the question of consciousness and free will and all these things, where it's not so obvious that there's a connection. I think the place where a connection does come in, and Ned Block knows something about this, is the theory called functionalism, which says that the material that the brain is made out of really doesn't matter. It's the functions that the various parts carry out and how they interact with each other. And if we call that a kind of mathematics, because to work out in detail what it implies does involve some mathematics, then I think one has to be very careful not to go too far. And what we see today is this metaphor, if you will, that the brain is a kind of computer. It started out with the first electronic computers after the war, which were called electronic brains in the papers and magazines of that era. And you still hear that phrase once in a while. And so we have a whole field where every paper you read now says this piece of cortex computes this and this does that. And I think ex post facto, you can't deny that. As signals come in, there are electric signals on neurons. They go into some area, some stuff happens, and other electrical signals come out. And ex post facto, that you can describe that as a computation. And but what that hides is, how did it get to work that way? What part did evolution play, and especially ontogeny, by which I mean the development of the individual interacting with the world. And that's why some of us think it's important to work not just with totally abstract mathematical models, but things like robots actually moving around in the world and receiving visual input from cameras, and trying to do something like an animal or a human would do in the real world. So I'll shut up now. I've taken enough time, but I just think it's very important to distinguish between those two kinds of areas where we use math as a theory and as a tool, and the consequences are different.
So let me say something about this. So in the areas in which I work, the metaphor of the brain as a computer has faded. I think its heyday was the 80s and maybe
well, it's still every day in neuroscience journals.
Okay, but here's the problem. One of the hallmarks of a computer is that there can be many ways of realizing, of making the same computational structure. So it's commonly said in introductory books about computation that you can do a computation with using an electronic computer. You could do the same computation using something with wheels and pulleys and gears. You could make a hydraulic setup that uses the same computational principles, the same program at some level of abstraction, but does it completely differently. But the upshot of a lot of neuroscience is that it's not so easy to see how you could do the same computation differently. Multiple realizability seems to be fading away when we see the complexity of the electrochemical processes. So neurons influence other neurons by sending out chemicals. And those chemicals diffuse. It's not clear that the computational picture is the right way of describing that.
Yeah, that's just what I'm
I
saying.
would agree with that to some extent, but the guy right before that, I don't know who's speaking at anything, but at any given time. But the idea of robots and external world and internal world. I mean, I don't see how that is of the use of mathematics. Math is all those. And to address a recent point, he has a good point. The brain is a computer. In fact, if you go back, the brain has been many things. It was back in Aristotle's time. I think it was pumps and water and things like that. And more recently, I heard a talk that it was all done by quantum mechanics and things like that. So whatever the newest theory is what the brain is, and it always bugs me because I think the brain is what it is, and math is just a way, as Ken said, of taking lots of abstract boxes and arrows that experimentalists put together. At least to me, I'm a hardened reductionist. And it's just a way of taking boxes and arrows and using it to, it's sort of an existence proof that this is the right mechanism. So I'm too stupid to ask why, but I'm a big fan of how.
Let me just add a few things about what has been said. I guess one reason that math is really important in neuroscience is that neuroscience is one of the fields in biology that are the most quantitative experimentally. So the neurophysiology, the measurements, the experiments are really quantitative. It has had a very long tradition of very quantitative measurements and analysis. And that actually is important to bear in mind. And that's why we are capable of using mathematical models and theory in this field. It's clear already, I guess, from what we heard, that we don't really know how to conceptualize the brain. We have all kinds of analogies, but certainly when you really compare brain with computer, they're just so dramatically different, right? So what computer is really great at, like making zillions of computations very quickly, we're not very good at. What we are really wonderful at, like recognizing objects, recognizing a face in a crowd, in a fuzzy, foggy kind of environment, computer is incapable of doing. Today's computer, right? So there's dramatically different, dramatic differences between the brain and the computers, as we know today. But on the other hand, clearly, if not consciousness, we need to think about the computation. What kind of computations that brain does? So that's another way of thinking about the connection between the brain and the mathematics.
I'm not sure that computation is going to turn out to be so important. As a number of people have mentioned, there are different levels of description, and computation can be important at one level but not at another. A standard example of this is the explanation of why a rigid square peg doesn't go through a hole in a rigid board, which can be done on the basis of the rigidity of the materials and the geometry of the hole and the peg. So at that level, there really isn't anything that would be called computation. Of course, if you go to the elementary particle level, then you could get an explanation which is computational, but which obscures the simple level of description. So it's not always clear. So I don't think you can, unless you trivialize the notion of computation by assuming that anything is a computation. It's a commonplace that you could regard a river as computing the rate of erosion of its banks as an analog model of itself. It's a computer that computes its own rate of erosion. So you can trivialize the notion of computation, but I don't think we can just assume a priori that the right way to think about the mind is going to be a computational level, a computational way at the most abstract level.
That's fair. I guess you could say, so what's the alternative? I guess one alternative would be, what really matters is behavior and thought, maybe mental life and our behavior, right? Can you describe those things without talking about the computation? So
well, as the guy on the screen said, we're always using the latest technology to describe the mind. And there's a famous paper by neuroscientist John Marshall that goes into the history of this, and he mentioned a few cases. But you know, at the time of the popularity of the catapult, people's theory of vision was that there's little catapults on objects that catapult a tiny simulacrum of the object into your eye. And then, of course, the famous telephone exchange model of the brain in the early days of telephones. So, you know, the computer is a very notable artifact, and if you trivialize the notion of computation, we can describe everything as a computer. But that doesn't mean that we know now that computation is going to be important in describing, for example, consciousness.
Well, I think, I mean, computer is a loaded word because it means, you know, the things that we have on our desks. And clearly they don't look anything like the brain does. But computation, I mean, I think the reason to use a word like that, I mean, maybe it's a matter of semantics and defining what we mean by it, but, you know, the heart, its biological function, obviously, is to make sure that blood and nutrition, you know, gets to every cell in the body. And so it has to be a very good pump and has to react, you know, pump more and less under different circumstances. The brain is a piece of meat that's sitting inside of our head whose function is in some way to take in information about the sensory world and guide behavior toward the animals, you know, to hold the animal's goals and guide behavior toward those goals. And to me, computation means that you have to process information. And that's the job of the brain. And that's all that computation means to me. But it's very clearly, you know, it's not what the heart does, that's not what the liver does, that's what the brain is for. It's for processing the information coming in from the sensory world and processing, you know, having a built-in sense of the animal's goals and working out the behaviors that are going to achieve those goals. That's a lot of information processing, and that's the reason for me for the word computation. It doesn't process the information anything like a computer does, but it has to process
information and computation are two different things.
I just have to throw it.
Is the diffusion of a chemical, is that computation? It can be described computationally, but is it a computation?
No,
it's the diffusion of a chemical in the brain. So I don't see, you know, it just seems to me to be trivializing the issue to call that computation.
Yeah.
Well,
and
what
I
is
have a slogan that I
computation?
just.
That's all the question. I mean, Stephen Wolfram called it cellular automata computation. And, you know, I think we're getting hung up on semantics here. And I do want to say that the metaphor of a computer or computation has got to be really careful, because when we do a computation on our computer, if we type the same thing, we get the same response every time. And the really cool thing about the brain is the fact that you don't, and that turns out to be really important, right? Because if you get the same thing every time, then you can't learn, you can't change, you can't adapt. And that's one real difference, I think, the metaphor of a computer and a real brain is that it you know, you don't get the same thing every time you do something.
Yeah. What I wanted to add to what Ken said, and it fits right with what you said, is I have a slogan: the function of the brain is not to process information, it is to create information. And there's a distinction, really trying to draw it between a process in the sense of an algorithm or a pre-planned design where you perform operations on numerical quantities and get some result, but it's this renewal, this learning, this initialization, if you will, of the infant who comes into the world not doing any of these things and somehow figures out, not because a programmer comes in and tweaks some neurons around to make it work right, but just by having experience in the world, and that's what the industrial, the desktop computer doesn't have, and as long as we understand that, then yeah, we're fine to say as Ken does, the visual cortex, computes edges and that sort of thing. Sure.
Well, I don't know what it computes. I think we're very naive about what it computes, but it's clearly taking in the visual world and ultimately leading us to open our eyes and see people and chairs and lights and to see objects and their relationships and to know a lot about them. But exactly what it does, computes to do that, I don't think we really know.
Yeah.
I guess I would just add that it's true that when you ask ourselves or ask people in daily lives, you think I don't really always think in terms of computation. I think what's my goal, what I need to do today. So in that sense, you start with a goal, you make decisions in order to achieve your goal, and you seek actively information from the environment. And sometimes you have to process information forced on you, but there is an active process that the main thing is to try to achieve your goals, right? The behavior goals. So in that sense, it's not it's different from the certainly very different from information processing from a computer perspective.
And it's also always trying to predict. I mean, you get partial information and you anticipate. Nobody, you watch somebody a ball and they're automatically, nobody is born with Newton's in there, but you figure out how to do this because you're trying to predict trajectories, and you're predicting what somebody's going to say. There's all kinds of cool psychophysics experiments that can exploit this, and that's another thing a computer really doesn't do very well, is sort of extrapolate to the future, because we have to do that to interact with the real world.
So in terms of the question of the role of mathematics, I'd like to just return to the idea of
that's good.
emergence.
Thanks, Ken.
Yeah, but to the idea of emergence, because for me, where theory plays, and theory is basically building models which are mathematical and computer models to try to put together the pieces to figure out how they explain phenomena, so it's when I say theory, you could substitute math if you like. And what the role of theory, the biggest role in trying to understand the brain, has to do with this idea of properties emerging at one level out of the complexity at another level. Physics has pioneered some thinking about that kind of problem in terms of understanding how you take a lot of water, a lot of molecules, and they end up having properties of being liquid and having a certain volume and a pressure. And so how the interactions at one level lead to these, at a very different level, these qualities, like being liquid and being viscous, that, in terms of a molecule, would have no meaning, but it emerges out of the interaction of many, many molecules. But the apparatus that physics developed is pretty specialized to those situations, and the brain is just unbelievably more complex, of course. But always what where theory really gives you insight is when you know a lot of things at one level and you know a lot of things at the next level. You know how these neurons respond to this situation, and you know something about what the neurons are made of and how they're connected to each other. But you have no idea how you get from here to there. And you try to put them together in terms of what you know. You have some ideas, and you find suddenly a principle, say, of how a circuit can be organized so that these properties, these actual responses to the world up here will emerge from these neurons down here. But again and again at every level, it's that process of new phenomena emerging out of the interactions of a complex interaction to many things at a completely different level. That's, I think, the most striking point where math is absolutely critical. You can't do it without math.
And the best example of that is one of the best examples is the first example of that, the Hodgkin-Huxley theory, which basically took a hypothesis about channels and gates and used that equations down, very simple, just 4 differential equations, and we're able to completely explain the action potential of the squid. That was the first real example of mathematics doing something very specific. And, I think things have continued on like that. That's exactly what, it's what Ken said. How do you take pieces of stuff and get emergent properties? The only way you can do that is with theory. And the only way you can do that the only way you can do that kind of theory is with mathematics. And that's the big difference between neuroscience and, say, physics, is every physics experiment is driven by theory. And no neuroscience experiments almost are ever driven by theory. And it's just kind of an immature science so far, I think.
I disagree that neuroscience isn't. I disagree that neuroscience isn't driven by theory. Certainly in the visual system, most of, or at least a great deal of what we know, was derived from the psychology of the visual system that was discovered before we knew the neuroscience of it. The three kinds of cones, the component process system, that was all discovered by visual psychologists well before we understood the neural underpinnings.
And Gestalt psychologists who contributed things about what's salient in a visual scene and so forth.
But
well, he's pushing.
Experiments
I was
are not
making a kind of hard case there. I don't completely. I agree with you guys. It's just not, not completely, but.
So maybe I guess one way, as Ken and Bart articulated, is to understand how you explain behavior at some level in terms of the interactions and dynamics at the level below, underneath it. So in a way, I guess my PhD advisor used to say, the world is like onion. There are many layers. And really, you gain satisfaction as a scientist by being able to explain something in terms of what's more fundamental, maybe underneath it. There's another aspect of it that really explains why mathematics is really important for neuroscience. That is, the nerve system has a lot of feedback loops. Okay, and there's positive feedback loops. So this neuron excites the other neuron that excites back this neuron. Or there's inhibitory, negative feedback loops. Like any, system with a lot of feedback loops, it's very hard to predict what's going to happen when you do something, right, somewhere. So I guess one example I like to give is, these days people talk about the connectivity, right? And so if you know connectivity, the connectome among genes or among neurons, it's very important information. You really learn a lot by knowing the anatomy and the connectivity. But the example I'm going to give you illustrates why that's not enough to predict behavior. Okay, imagine I give you a circuit with just two neurons that we know inhibit each other. Okay, neuron 1 inhibits neuron 2, and neuron 2 inhibits neuron 1. What are you going to predict? What's going to be the behavior you're going to get? Well, for a very long time, people think the behavior would be half-center oscillator. So neuron 1 is up, suppresses neuron 2, and then for some reason later on, this one goes up, the other one goes down. Okay, that's the motif for generating movements. So if you walk left, right, left, right. Okay, so that's the circuit to get this kind of pattern generation. But it turns out that when you really analyze the dynamics of this kind of circuit, you can have some other way of behavior. Yeah. You could have, for example, neuron 1 being up all the time and always suppressing neuron 2. So you have a switch, okay? You give a little kick for neuron 2, that switches neuron 1 up, neuron 2 up, and suppresses neuron 1. So that, gives you a mechanism to build a switch. Does that make sense? And it turns out that surprisingly, in fact, under some conditions, even if those two neurons inhibit each other, sometimes they are completely in sync. So they go up together, they go down together, they go up together, right? And this is a very counterintuitive kind of behavior of perfect synchrony by mutual inhibition. Turns out to be, actually happening in real life in the brain. And this is the mechanism now, one of the mechanisms at least, for explaining brain waves that we all see, when you do EEG measurements, for example. This is, I think, a very, very interesting example where only by looking at the dynamics with the help of math, we can really figure out what's possible in this kind of system with feedback loops.
And actually, let me just build on that because, say in that case, the idea of them working together is essentially they both fire, they both suppress each other, and then they both recover together. And then they're active, they both fire, they both suppress each other. So it gives you a new intuition. You study the math, maybe you hadn't thought of that before. But you write down the equations, you study them, and you discover this other regime where things are going together instead of opposite, which is all you'd really thought of. And then once the math has shown you this new regime, now I can explain it to you without any equations. So the math often acts like a scaffolding out of which we could, that we use to gain an intuitive understanding that we can then express without the math. And that's at least when I really feel like I understand something. But the math is incredibly rich. I mean, the full details are in there, but as you study it and you start to see it behave in ways you didn't expect, and then you start to try to work out why exactly is it doing that, you ultimately come up with a story you can tell. And when you can tell yourself a story that explains it, which is a new intuition that you didn't have before, but you discovered it by working on the math and figuring out why it's doing what it's doing, that's the scaffolding of math leading to the intuitive understanding.
So are you saying that it's not that you have an intuition and then the math can explain it, but you are saying that the math itself creates the intuition?
By banging on the math and the behaviors that you don't understand and figuring out why they're doing what they're doing, you gain new intuitions. Yeah.
One thing it's important in this is that the correct math at one level may be quite different from the correct math at another level. And the example of the computer is a good case. So, the computer operates by these binary elements, but of course, at a deeper level, they're not binary at all. They're fluctuations of voltage, but at the computational level, we have to think of them as binary in order to understand the computation.
So if I understand correctly, I mean, math has always had a place in neurophysiology because when you talked about electric currents and voltages and so on, so you always had a kind of high school math or college math when I went to medical school, that was there. But what you are saying is that what we are doing is not just understanding what happens, let's say, when a current goes along a nerve, how can we explain it physically and mathematically? But that mathematical ideas allow us to understand things that without them we couldn't even imagine are there.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, like, how if you press your hands and
Press what?
and you'll start to see little flash of light. After a while, you'll start to see, geometric patterns like checkerboards flashing and things like that. So why? What is going on there? And it's not obvious that this is all probably in the visual cortex. But what's the mechanism? And math kind of gives you this umbrella. And for example, the example that Xiao-Jing gave of two mutually inhibitory neurons, one guy making one guy a switch, okay? That's a switch and it's completely symmetric. One guy can be up, the other guy can be up. Okay, that's an example, the simplest example of what we'll call spontaneous pattern formation. And what math does is give you this sort of broad brush in which to explain lots and lots of patterns that you see. For example, Ken has done lots of work on things called ocular dominance patterns in the visual cortex. And it's all based, and I've done stuff on the phosphor. I just told you about the flicker and pressing your eyeballs, and they all work with the same basic principle of, I guess we call it Mexican hat, that there's excitation, or also we could call it Reaganomics, where you help the guy that you help your buddies and then you inhibit everybody else. But it's called lateral inhibition. I forgot to say that. That's it's been known from the horseshoe crab and all the way up, and it pretty much can do. It's a very straightforward concept, but it allows you to explain so many things, and it's all under sort of there's a very broad mathematical theory that covers all these cases.
Well, Are you done, Bart?
Yeah, I'm
Yeah,
sorry. I'm sorry.
No. I'm thinking back something Ned said way back at the beginning about different multiple solutions to the same problem, and just looking at the math alone, and never mind the neuroscience, we find that there are different kinds of math we can use to apply to a neural system or a neural network, if I'll use that word. And so we find in our field that sometimes people get stuck in one or another of these, and maybe a conversation like this can help. What I'm thinking of is, I edited a book where some authors, with a lot of different subjects, but there were authors in there who felt that most of the neural modeling that people are doing today is all wrong because it divides neurons up into little pieces called compartmental models, where you say everything that's going on in this little bit is the same, and then it's hooked to another little bit by a resistor, and that simplifies the computation. But that's not really right, because the voltage along the membrane changes in a continuous manner, and so you really should use differential equations. And so what you end up is pages and pages of so-called Green's function solutions and things, and the most complicated system these guys have been able to work out is two neurons talking to each other. And you get a lot of insight from that, and you get a lot of insight from understanding how the diameter of the cable, as it changes as you get farther away from the cell body, affects how the voltage is changing. And you can go on like that and spend a whole career doing that, and meanwhile you haven't gone to the next level up, as Ken and many of us are interested in. So it behooves all of us who are in this field, I think, to be aware of these different levels and be willing to move up and down among them as befits the particular problem of interest. Maybe what I said is super obvious.
Well, actually, to pick up on that, one thing that I think maybe is maybe surprising to people not in the field is that it's not the case that you put every detail into your model.
Yeah, right.
If you do, all is lost. You don't have any hope at all, because let me see, there's a couple of reasons. So one is that there's many details. Exactly what kinds of channels do you have in the membrane, and what are the physical properties of each of these channels, and how do they respond in which way, and what's their density, and on and on and on. How exactly do your dendrites spread out in space? Most of those details we don't really know. We know that there are such things, and that they have some structure, and we have maybe some range in which they all live. But so the more of these details you put in, the more unconstrained by data freedom you put into your model, the more unconstrained by data complexity you put into your model. And if your model then goes and does something, how are you going to figure out why it does it when there's so many unconstrained details? And so part of the real art of modeling is the art of simplification, the art of knowing what are the key relationships that I want to model. And then I want to understand what emerges from them. And I'm going to throw all the rest away to simplify, to just understand what do these dynamics of these simple entities that I'm going to model lead to, and can I identify that? Can I then understand what's going on in the brain with this simplification, and then in some way that's testable, that says, oh, well, if this simple structure leads to all this stuff, then it also should lead to this other stuff people haven't looked at, so let's go and measure that. Somebody, I think Idan Segev is another theoretical neuroscientist, and I think maybe he was quoting Picasso. I've kind of lost track of the quotes, but they talked about modeling as the lie that reveals the truth. Because you start out with a lie. You start out with a simplification. You have to. And there's actually a big to-do in the field right now. There's something called the Blue Brain Project of Henry Markham in Switzerland, where his claim and belief is that he's going to put every detail into the computer, and out is going to emerge the brain, and then we're going to understand the brain. And I have to say, every theoretical neuroscientist I know thinks that is nuts, including myself. Because something will happen, God knows why, God knows what it depends on, God knows which detail was important and which wasn't. Maybe you can maneuver it to do things like the brain, maybe you can't. I mean, at the moment they have some very basic behavior. Things excite and inhibit other things. I mean, nothing very specific, and they say, see, we replicated the brain. But when you throw in every detail, I mean, the essence of understanding, that you know, when we build this scaffold and then eventually I can tell you a story, that story can't have a billion moving parts in it because our brains can't handle it. And so we don't understand it. Now, if we knew what those billion moving parts were down to the physical details, then like physicists, where they do know those billion moving parts, you know, in real detail, they can just put it in the computer and see what it does because they really have control over all of that complexity from the data. But we don't. And so we have to simplify, and we have to come to stories of how some interaction at one level leads to an interaction at another level. So that I do models where very often, sometimes I use more complicated models, but very often I use models where I take a neuron, which is, you know, a spatially extended object with dendrites that are, you know, extending over hundreds of microns that are communicating with each other in complicated ways, receiving all kinds of inputs at different places, and integrating that input in complicated ways. And I describe it as a point neuron that just takes a lot of input, sums them, does a certain nonlinearity to them. But then I study how these interactions, who's connected to who, the circuitry among these point neurons, what behavior that leads to. And lo and behold, you discover things that tell you a lot, give you new insight into how the brain works. Now, we've thrown away a lot of detail of integration, and that worries me. Maybe those details of integration, when we put them in, are going to radically change things. But the fact that you come up with an insight that unifies an awful lot of behavior in a simple way, and that's testable and the tests bear out, that gives me a lot of confidence, although not a certainty, that all those details are not going to overturn what I've learned by studying things at this level.
Well, so you learn both by what you can explain and what you can't. So if you can't explain something, it shows that the detail was important.
Well, no, because you don't know. Maybe you just missed it, right? You don't know why you can't. Negative results. When you can, then you've really got your hands on something.
Mm-hmm. It's hard to get non-existent proof in these things. Yeah. Mm-hmm. The other thing, I think, this is building on what Ken said, is you start with something simple and you see what it is, a port neuron or whatever, and then you use that to build up your model. I think I want to point the other side of the coin. We've been talking a lot about what mathematics can do for neuroscience, but the other thing is, what can neuroscience do for mathematics? And there's one of these big questions, or one question that many of us are very interested in, is if you've got many detailed models of neurons hooked together, is there a principled way you make a simplified model out of that? And people call this trying to derive a mean field theorem from some sort of spiky neurons. Xiao-Jing has done a lot of this. I've done some of this. I don't know about the other guys. Ken might have. But again, this requires new mathematics as well, and difficult mathematics, because there's noise and stochasticity and things like that. So I think there's this great positive feedback between neuroscience and math, and a lot of nice mathematics has come out of trying to answer even some of the simplest neuroscience questions.
We only heard about every other word of some of that.
Oh.
Yeah, it's cutting out a lot.
Yeah.
I guess.
Oh, well.
You wanted.
Yeah, it seems to be bad right. I don't know what's the matter. Is it my connection? No.
Who knows?
We don't know.
Okay.
You were going to...
Oh, well.
But keep trying. I'm hearing enough that I can make sense of it, but maybe it's because I know some of the words that are being left out. So.
Maybe just recap a little bit what Bart was saying. Basically, he's saying that, I guess rephrasing it, you could say, in the past or even today, physics is really a major source of mathematics, right? A lot of physics problems, particle physics especially, for example, has led to many new branches in math. And maybe today, biological sciences, especially neuroscience, in fact, is going to provide a new source for problems and maybe ideas that will inspire new math. So one of the specific example Bart mentioned is the so-called mean field theory. How do you go from most biologically based action potential kind of neural models and neural network models to population description? Okay, where you say, for each little group of neurons, they all, within this group, all the neurons are more or less doing the same thing. What I really care about is the dynamics of the activity, the overall population activity of this neural group. So can I find a systematic way, mathematical way, to derive, more biophysically based spiking neural model to a population description? That's one example. And
that's what I said.
Yeah.
Really?
Essentially.
I guess I just add, it's really true. People actually feel like today there's going to be really a lot of interesting questions, in part from neuroscience, that's going to inspire new math. So, for example, not just neuroscience, of course. I guess I would just mention one example is, the kind of dynamics that really live in very, very high dimensional space. Okay, so if you think about, really the nerve system, describe it in certain ways, you basically need zillions of variables, zillions of activity variables for neurons or neural populations. So you have to describe the dynamics in a very high dimensional space. And the math of dynamics in very high dimensional space is true in neuroscience and maybe true in some other scientific branches, given the data we now have today. So, and I think that's one of the examples where this science, including neuroscience, drives math.
Yeah. I can give another example that I just ran into on a thesis committee of a physics student at Rockefeller named Thibaut Taillet-Fumier, who was interested, but he comes down to the random walk problem, but expressed in terms of a neuron. You have a neuron, some noise sources, the membrane potential is fluctuating around, and a question you'd like to ask is, how long do you expect it will be before one of those fluctuations goes over threshold and the neuron fires? And so if you look at the fluctuations as what is called a random walk in other areas of biology or chemistry, this is a problem where a lot of work has been done, but he was able, by looking at it from the point of view of a neuroscience problem, to produce some new mathematics that adds to that whole body of work. So there's another, just an example.
I think a very beautiful example of making some new math is some work done by Fred Wolf and his group in Germany that was recently published in Science, where they're trying to understand certain patterns that form in the arrangement of the neurons in the visual cortex, of what neurons in the primary visual cortex are responsive to light-dark edges of a certain orientation, and they care very much about the orientation. If you change the orientation of the edge by 20 or 30 degrees, they may stop responding. And what orientation they prefer is laid out in a way that sort of rotates periodically as you move across the cortex, so that all the orientations are represented. But it's laid out in a particular kind of pattern, and Fred, so in physics, there's quite a lot of literature on pattern formation, on how interactions among chemicals may lead to some kind of stripy behavior and so forth, to some pattern emerging. And there's a very established literature of how you can go about analyzing those processes. Those have always dealt with real valued variables, though. So I don't know if you all know about real numbers and complex numbers. Complex numbers are an important part of mathematics, but in the pattern formation literature, just because these are physical variables, these have all been real valued variables that are organizing into patterns. It turns out that the proper description of these patterns, you need to use complex valued variables. And that required Fred to really revise or extend the existing methodology on pattern formation into that case, and he also had to bring another extension to it, which is in physics, all of the interactions are local. Things just talk to their neighbors. They're not able to talk to somebody way over here directly, because there's no long-range connections between molecules, say. But among neurons, there are long-range connections. And so he had to bring in the role of long-range connections as well into how this influences pattern formation. And the upshot is, I mean, he spent 10 or 15 years developing this theory layer by layer by layer by layer. And the great triumph was he was able to predict that the structure of these maps, it should have a certain signature, which is the density of points where all orientations meet, which are called pinwheels or singularities. And that density in the right unit should be the number pi. And they went and they measured it. And so people had measured, and to do that, they had to develop new quantitative methods of measuring the density of pinwheels, because there's always a lot of noise and it depends on how you filter things, and they had to find ways of filtering out the noise that didn't filter out the signal, which people hadn't had good ways of measuring pinwheel density before. And so they developed new mathematics for that, and people had studied maybe a few maps at a time, but they studied 100 maps with 10,000 singularities in order to get good enough statistics, and they found that the density was pi to within plus or minus 2%, meaning that, and what that meant for us in terms of the physics of it, or in terms of what happened, how do these patterns emerge, is basically this number pi, this organization that's characterized by this number pi, emerges very naturally out of self-organization, meaning it's not, every cell isn't told by genetics what orientation to develop. Rather, they develop by interacting with one another. Maybe they excite their neighbors, and they may have some long-range suppression. And so they're developing through interaction, and this self-organization among all these moving parts leads to this pattern. And the fact that he was able to show that you get this very robust prediction of pi under that scenario, and then he went and measured it, and that's right, what was there. And it was there across 3 different species that are separated by hundreds of millions of years in evolution. And in fact, separated so far that their common ancestor had such a tiny visual cortex that it probably didn't have these patterns at all, meaning that it had to evolve, that this pi pattern had to evolve twice independently. Well, that would happen naturally if it's just this, if it happens by this self-organization process. If you think it's genetically specified, that would be very hard to explain. So I think this was a huge triumph, and it was an advance in the math and an advance in our understanding of the biology.
An argument that the pinwheel structure isn't genetically determined, at least not in any simple way, is Reganker-Seur's ferrets, where he was able to set up something where they use their auditory cortex to perceive visually, able to rewire the ferrets at a very early age. They also show that auditory cortex shows that pinwheel structure.
Although actually, it does show pinwheels, but I don't think it's that characteristic structure that Fred has identified.
So I see, so it's different pinwheels.
Yeah. I think it's a lot. I think it's different. I'm not absolutely certain of that, but I think it's different.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we seem to be at a dead moment, so I'll just change the subject slightly and say there's still plenty of room for new progress in this whole field, and the diffusion of molecules has been mentioned a couple of times. So I just wanted to say, I suggested in a book chapter some time ago that in studying the brain, we needed to combine not just what neurons are doing, but what molecules are doing, and proposed using a kind of finite element modeling, which is what engineers do who build skyscrapers and bridges, looking at the physics of how little blocks of matter interact under pressure. And this was rejected by referees as being ridiculous, although I thought it might have something to do, for example, with studying tumors in the brain and how a tumor might press on another part of the brain and cause something not to function because pressure might be changing the activity of ion channels or something. But I just saw in a recent document that I'm reading, which is, it's a PhD thesis, that this is now being applied, this kind of idea in the eye, where people are working on retinal prostheses, and the idea there is to, in a blind person who's lost the visual receptors, it's known that the so-called retinal ganglion cells, the cells that send the output of the retina back to the brain, those are often still functional even when the receptors are not. So the person is blind, but that part of the eye is good. So the proposal, and it's been tried now in in real life by different groups, is to stick some sort of array of electrodes into the back of the eye and stimulate these retinal ganglion cells to provide some sort of prosthetic vision. And so this thesis that I'm reading has done just, he of course never saw my proposal, it must have come out of his own ideas, but the idea of making a finite element model of the fluid in the eye and then using the laws of the laws of electricity and magnetism to figure out how, when you put a little current into an electrode, how does that spread through that fluid and which ganglion cells does it affect? So you can figure out what's the best way to compute what, now in a computer, what stimulus to put into that electrode array to get the most natural vision. So there's a very new kind of extension of what we've all been doing, looking at just one neuron talking to another and taking into account this ionic environment. And I think this is a very positive thing to be happening right now. You may know more about this than I do. I don't know.
I think, you bring up, okay, so it seems we've sort of switched a little bit to pathology, I guess, because this is a bad retina. And can you guys hear me every other word, or do I have to speak twice, or I'm okay?
Yeah, right now.
Okay, all right. So, let me give you an example of where math can be very helpful in pathologies. Is one of the classic mechanisms for Parkinson's disease is something called deep brain stimulation. And the problem with deep brain stimulation is it's really, really stupid. It just does the same thing over and over again, and it doesn't depend on any feedback or anything else. But there's a number of groups. There's groups in Germany and there's groups in the US that have developed much smarter versions of deep brain stimulation based on writing down some for what happens in the basal ganglia, whether you treat them as oscillators or as excitatory inhibitory networks. And by using that, they've been able to come up with techniques for deep brain stimulation. And this could not have been done without the math predicting this method would work. But much more efficient ways of doing deep brain stimulation that won't come on until there's a sense that something's wrong. And when it comes on, it does it much more efficiently. Instead of jolting it with, hundreds of millivolts of stuff, they can do things in much lower levels, and therefore improve things like battery life and also reduce damage a great deal to the brain.
Some of that work is going on at Rockefeller, too, in the lab of Donald Pfaff, who I want to mention because he's on the board of this organization that's sponsoring us today. And he has a student doing deep brain stimulation in a mouse model of traumatic brain injury. And they're not, unfortunately, not doing what you say in terms of the math of what the network is doing, but what they have done is try out different modes of stimulation, whether it's a random or a chaotic or a pure regular oscillation, and do these different modes of stimulation produce better results in that mouse model. So again, this is something kind of new that's going on in just a few places, and very positive, I think.
Especially for this audience, maybe it's also worth mentioning something related. So actually, I'm on my way to a kind of short summer school on so-called computational psychiatry. So there are several places, including Yale and Germany and UCL in London, where people feel like if we are starting to have some understanding about the circuit mechanisms of brain structures, especially the prefrontal cortex, that are implicated in mental disorders. So if we know something about the circuitry in this part of the brain, so it's not all the brains are really the same. Okay, so we know that there are early sensory areas that are, optimized for information processing, and then there are some kind of more cognitive areas that are more implicated in decision making and control of our behavior. So prefrontal cortex is one the best example perhaps of cognitive type circuitry that's implicated in many mental illness disorder types. So there's a sense that, and again, these systems are very complex to just try to understand by intuition alone, and the circuit modeling has helped, together with experimentation, to kind of tease out, what really might go on in normal subjects as well as in patients like schizophrenic patients or autism, for example. I mean, we know a bit about schizophrenia, maybe much less, very little still, but something about schizophrenia, but even less on autism, I think. But still, the idea is that if mathematics, the really biologically based model of prefrontal cortex, if such a thing can be done, would provide a very useful platform to really explore what may go wrong if this goes down, if that goes up, if at the circuitry level. And if that's the case, it really provides a tool for us to also try to understand what really underlies cognitive deficits in mental disorders.
And there's just hypothesis and speculation, but so the cerebral cortex is the main stuff that makes us smart. It's peculiar to mammals, the part of the brain that evolves specifically in mammals. It's all the folded up stuff you see on the surface, and it's what you see with and hear with and think with, and pretty much I think it's fair to say that your whole conscious life is computed there. I don't want to say what consciousness is, but let's say whatever does enter consciousness is computed there. It has, what has always fascinated anyone who tries to study cortex is that it looks so much the same no matter what it's doing. Whether it's doing, here's a piece that's analyzing the visual scene, here's a piece that's analyzing touch, here's a piece that's analyzing audition, here's a piece that's involved in motor planning and thinking and speaking. And there are differences. There definitely are differences, but the first thing that strikes you is how much they look alike, how much they seem to be the same architecture, the same processing unit. And so it makes all of us dream, at least, that there is a fundamental processing unit that was invented in mammalian evolution that's very good at doing something, which, when we really understand it, we'll be able to fill in what that something is, but something like being able to take a varying world, find invariant structure in it, represent that invariant structure associatively, and then do that again and again and again. So there's also a hypothesis that some diseases like schizophrenia or autism might be not specifically cognitive deficits of the cortex, specifically deficits in particular cognitive regions, but they might be deficits in that processing unit that therefore would manifest not only in higher order cognitive processing, but you would also see it in low-level visual processing. And indeed, in schizophrenia, for example, there's something in much of sensory cortex called surround suppression. It's the lateral inhibition that Bard was talking about before, which is that if I have a neuron that responds to some visual stimulus here, then what's around it, the context, can suppress the responses somewhat. It turns out that the people with schizophrenia have much weaker surround suppression in primary visual cortex. And you can imagine that some kind of, that could be some kind of global deficit in integrating local information here or local information there, putting it together, that perhaps in some way that I couldn't explain to you might add up to the cognitive deficits that we see in schizophrenia when that deficit is happening in the right brain region. So we don't know, but it's possible that these are diseases of the cortical processing unit and not of very specific cognitive functions.
Would that kind of problem with the processing unit also be able to explain why schizophrenia is sometimes a deteriorating condition? In other words, one would imagine if once that processing is that way, then it should stay the same way.
Yes, no, it's a good question. I can't say that I've thought out all the implications of this. I'm really deep into schizophrenia. I've been struck by the fact that there are these very low-level deficiencies in schizophrenia, and in certain ways in autism, it's been shown that at low-level sensory areas, there's much more variability in the processing. The mean response to a given stimulus is the same, but there's much more variability in the response. So that it gives me the hint that there are maybe more general processing problems in the cortex, but I don't know enough at that level of detail to answer that.
There's lots of very specific deficits in especially in the prefrontal cortex, in the inhibitory circuitry. Some of the receptors become slower. They become weaker. It may be compensation because there's also deficits in the excitatory stuff. So I think it's basically what Ken was saying is that it's this basic circuitry, this 7-layer or 6 or 7-layer structure, and there's something that goes wrong with. And as Ken pointed out, if you weaken some of these and things like Xiao-Jing, if you weaken these inhibitory things, for example, which inhibitory guys are what kind of keep everything controlled. I mean, the cortex is highly recurrent, highly excitatory recurrent, and because of that, any kind of perturbation of this controlling inhibition can lead to all kinds of dramatic pathologies, activity where you don't want it, not being able to hold activity, spread of activity where it shouldn't go. That's for example, epilepsy, and spontaneous activity when it's not there. For example, hallucinations that are some of the negative things that happen with, or positive things that happen with. So yeah, I think and math can really help us tear apart how these deficits in inhibition or deficit in the circuitry can lead to some sort of macroscopic measure. For example, one thing that they found associated with cognitive deficits in schizophrenia, people have greatly reduced certain kinds of rhythms in the brain that Xiao-Jing alluded to, these ones that are related to mutual inhibition and generating these 40 to 60 hertz rhythms in the brain. And those rhythms are shown to be diminished in schizophrenics also. So, math can kind of connect these deficits in circuitry with the macroscopic rhythms and hopefully some of the cognitive deficits.
So to relate to what Bart and King just said, I guess one way to view this is to say, there's a canonical general layout. There's a general organization of, say, cerebral cortex, and that's universal, let's say. Okay, it's true in early sensory areas like primary visual cortex as well as prefrontal cortex. But what's interesting is that there could be some quantitative differences, right? And so to use the same analogy as used before, you have the same matter, same material, which can be either in the liquid state or solid state, depending on the temperature, right? So you could say just by changing something, temperature, in a graded fashion, sometimes by a small amount, if you are near the solidification critical point, just relatively small change of certain things will give you a very different kind of behavior, right? And that's how I see it, like, comparing sensory area versus the prefrontal cortex. Okay, so and that really is very important and very interesting to realize. And then you can ask, even by the same amount of change of certain things due to genetic defect or due to environmental insult, what's the impact on sensory system versus a more cognitive type of system? So by understanding the operational mode, the behavior of each system, we can indeed address, look at, examine how abnormalities can occur in each of the areas. Yeah.
Let me ask Ken a question, because you emphasize the unity of structure across the cortex, but of course, as you well know, and we all do, there's differences. More than 100 years ago, Brodmann described all of these numbered areas, and they have slight differences in the population of different cell types or the lengths of the dendrites or various. I'm sure you didn't mean to denigrate that, but just do you feel that those anatomical differences that are easily visible can be related, in fact, to the functional differences that Xiao-Jing is talking about, or
I think
should we be looking at whether we can understand why those differences are there, or is it just sort of peripheral and unimportant, accidental, I mean to say?
No, I mean, I think ultimately we need to understand those variations. I guess I very much take XJ's point. Sorry, we call Xiao-Jing XJ. So that's what I'm used to calling him. I very much take XJ's point that there may be some commonality, but it may be operating in a different regime. And in particular, one difference that's very well known is that in primary sensory cortex, the excitatory neurons make much fewer synapses onto each other. So an individual neuron in primary visual cortex might receive 700 excitatory synapses, but in prefrontal cortex it might receive 20,000 excitatory synapses. And that has an obvious, theoretically what you expect from that is that the place with 20,000 excitatory synapses is much more likely to be able to generate its own activity in the absence of a stimulus, which in fact is one of the big differences between frontal cortex and primary sensory cortex, where without a stimulus, there's some background activity going on, but it doesn't generate the kind of activity through the stimulus. But frontal cortex has to generate its own activity. It's got to make motor plans and make the animal go. So that's one example of a numerical change that leads to a qualitative change in your operating regime, and you may have a lot of the same structure underneath. I'm sure that's probably, if we got down to every one of Brodmann's areas, every one of them would have some specialization that gives us every specialization in structure has got to be there for some specialization in function, and we don't know what it is. But I prefer
preserved it, so it must do something.
Yeah, I prefer right now to try to focus on, what is the basic operation of this unit, rather than before we tackle all of its variations. But I do think between sensory and motor, those are really two fundamentally different things that we need to each understand.
Well, how about
I want to
what the unit
add
itself
something,
is? That seems like more basic
if I
question.
can, it's also who you're talking to and who talks to you that really matters. So the prefrontal cortex gets information from lots of other different things than the visual cortex. So even though the hardware is the same, the connectivity, and I guess we come back to the old connect story, is different, and I think that can also be a big reason why there's a difference in functionality. I mean, it's just simply that you're getting, the CPUs are the same. It's just the memory and who you're talking to is completely different.
Yeah, right on.
You want to finish or
Oh, yeah, I think, the point you were making before about we don't know what the units are yet. Look, I take the unit story very seriously. For one thing, it seems evolutionarily plausible. We know that there's plenty of reason to think that the increase in cortex that we have from earlier stages is just duplication. We have all these areas that seem to be basically descended from retinas that, we needed more cortex to make another retina. So there does seem to be some reason to think that from an evolutionary point of view, it's a matter of just duplication. But it seems amazing that we don't know what these units are.
Well, they're incredibly complex.
How many neurons in such a unit would you say?
What's the size of the unit? So what we think of as
What do you mean by it?
Yeah, I mean the unit is a totally hypothetical, speculative object right now. But what's commonly thought, going back to the work of Hubel and Wiesel 40, 50 years ago, is that about a square millimeter of cortex is sort of processing a local bit of information, and that contains about 100,000 neurons. And then when you consider, though, that these different units are talking to each other, because you don't only process local information, you're modulated by your context. So how big should we take the processing unit to be? But that gives you a
I've asked
beginning.
the same question to other neuroscientists, and sometimes I get the answer 10,000 neurons. I mean, it just shows how hypothetical it is if we don't if we don't have methods of estimating that.
Well, I mean, we know how many neurons there are in a given area, but the question is, how big an area should we call a unit?
Yeah.
He has
Well,
to
there was
leave
a
at
great-
4:30, so I'd like to move it towards question time if possible.
Oh, sure.
Any questions?
There's
please?
one back there.
You have to go to the microphone. No, we can't have it recorded, so you can just walk through here. Right there.
So much of what goes on in the brain depends on pattern recognition all the time, every perception that we make, every thought that we have. And the whole world of metaphor depends on a more sophisticated pattern recognition. Now, my simple question is it conceivable that there is some mathematical expression of whatever matches one pattern to another? Because we can't work without it. That's my question.
I think that's the holy grail for understanding cortex. I mean, I think we will get there, but we're not there yet.
So just to say something about what we know about pattern recognition, what we don't know. So it was shown a long time ago that pigeons can recognize patterns that we have not been able to make a machine that can recognize. So for example, it was shown, I think 30 years ago, that so this was done by a famous, maybe infamous Harvard psychologist named Herrnstein. He got a bunch of pictures from the National Geographic, that some of which had people or parts of people in them. Sometimes they were like, a tree trunk with some fingers on one side, and others that had no people in them or no parts of people. And he got pigeons he trained pigeons so that they could recognize the difference between a picture that had a person or a part of a person. And they did very well, better than some of the students in his lab. Because actually they're flying things, they could do better in aerial photographic, they could do better in the aerial analysis. We don't have any kind of artificial pattern recognizer that can do that. We don't know how it's done. So,
but I do believe that when we understand it, we will understand it mathematically. That is until you can describe mathematically how you take the image and what you do with it in order to recognize the pattern in it, then we won't understand that. And I think we will understand it. My own feeling is that we're not going to figure it out by trying to invent algorithms. We're going to figure it out by studying how nature did it, which is how our brains do it. Because I don't think we're smart enough to reinvent that ourselves. I think we have to discover it.
It's an important point that I agree with what you just said, but it reveals a real tectonic shift in this field, where there was a time when people thought they could discover it. They could discover these
just by thinking about it.
Just by thinking about it.
Yeah.
David Moore.
Yeah. No, the analogy I like to make is that quantum mechanics is the weirdest theory. I mean, you get used to it and it makes sense to you, but never in a billion years would anybody have figured it out just by thinking about it. Physicists had to knock their heads on atoms and the weird way that atoms behave, and knock their heads again and again and again for decades, until they finally somehow knocked their heads enough that they managed to get to the point of quantum mechanics. And then it started explaining things. And I think understanding how the brain instantly recognizes things, and I think it's in the same category.
Yeah. I know there's a line over here, but I really want to throw in two things. First, famously in that Herrnstein experiment, people complained just what you said, that the birds fly around so they would know about trees. So he got the pigeons also to recognize scenes that had fish or not fish, which the pigeons had never seen. But no, my point was going to be, we don't know how this works, but I firmly believe that part of the story is going to be what I've said earlier this afternoon, the interaction of the young individual with the world. The way we're going to recognize patterns that connect with each other is because they occur together in time or space, on and off during development, and parts of the brain are, I believe, wired in such a way as to respond to those connections. And that's what you cannot get by describing patterns geometrically or with words. It's all part of a scene. And we know that we recall things in connection with stimuli that were part of that scene when we first saw that pattern that may be totally unrelated. I recognize a certain Beethoven symphony because when I played the record years and years ago, there was a scratch at one point, and that scratch is in my brain at that point in the music, and that's how I know that with that. So, it's the whole surround, not just one thing that makes patterns. Okay, I'll shut up.
My name's Larry Amsel. I'm actually a mathematically oriented psychiatrist, which is a relatively rare thing. In 2003, I organized the first symposium at the American Psychiatric on game theory and psychiatry, and it was roundly ridiculed. I just have to, it and I were roundly ridiculed for this notion that game theory could be applicable to psychiatry. So I've been thinking about these ideas for a long time, and I want to thank this panel for bringing this here. I think it's absolutely fantastic and cutting-edge kind of discussion. I'd just like to say that if the hypothesis for today is whether or not the mind can be described by mathematics, I would consider the negation of that. I mean, if the mind cannot be explained by mathematics, how could you possibly explain it? What other language are you going to propose to do it in? First of all, you're irreducibly a dualist if you propose another language. If you propose another language, you're irreducibly a dualist. Second of all, you're rejecting evolution because evolution is about maximization under competition, which is only a mathematically solvable problem. Third of all, you would have to propose that there's some brain-dependent language that do a better job than mathematics, which I think is as close as we get to a brain-independent language.
Thank you.
I don't think we need any comments on that. I don't think anybody will disagree with that here. Well, I don't know, maybe the philosopher, but
okay.
That's just.
So if the notion of statistical mechanics leads us to conclude that phenomenon like pressure emerge from the interaction of molecules, is it the prediction of the panel then that a complete physiological and structural description of some neural system is going to then lead to the deduction that we have in front of us a cognitive system? In other words, once the physical language of a system of neurons is described completely, do you think, or is it the opinion of the group, that we will then come to the conclusion that we've, in essence, described the mechanism of cognition without being able to fully describe what cognition is? Perhaps this touches on the notion of consciousness versus not, but just let's say even from an information theoretic perspective, what are the thoughts of the panel?
Well, I said something that's relevant to this earlier, the example of the square peg in the round hole. Okay, so you could get an explanation of that, quote, explanation, in terms of the elementary particle clouds, but it would just obscure the explanation that you can see in terms of geometry and rigidity. You could add to it by explaining why those things that are rigid, or when they would fail to be rigid. But some explanations have an appropriate level that isn't illuminated from below. And sometimes the what's below is so complicated that you have no hope of deducing the molar behavior from what's below. So I think we have to find the right level for any given phenomenon that we're interested in.
Does this, in a sense, become a sort of short?
But that doesn't answer his question, which is, will this emerge, and will consciousness or cognition emerge from this low level? And I think as reductionists, or at least most of us as reductionists, the answer has to be yes. I don't know how that levels we'll have to ignore and what coarse grading we have to do, but I don't see how we can't answer that question as yes.
Look, there's a distinction between being a physicalist, which I am. I don't believe in any soul that somehow interferes with the elementary particles. There's a difference between being a physicalist and being a reductionist. So you're a physicalist, you think, okay, it's all just matter. It's somehow got the consciousness and cognition have to come out of matter. But that's different from thinking you're going to be able to take any explanation you get at the cognitive level and reduce it to an explanation in terms of the smallest items. That is a very adventurous, controversial claim, even for physicalists. So that's why I keep saying you have to find the right level.
I guess the only thing I would like to add is...
Well, I don't understand the alternative.
Well,
Well, maybe the thing, I guess it's probably fair to say that for very good reasons that neuroscience has been for a very long time focused on early sensory information processing and the motor behavior, but it's becoming more and more common now that people feel like you can study the neuron biological mechanism of cognitive processes, such as decision making in a rigorous way. So, and that's a sea change in my mind. So many things that people thought were in the realm of psychologists are now really being studied in a very cross-disciplinary fashion with cognitive psychologists and neurophysiologists and computational theorists working together to understand really the mechanism of even cognition, I would say.
In answer to your comment, it seems that one of the aspirations then is to be able to come up with a descriptive mechanism to talk about very high dimensionality systems. In a sense, for any of us, it's very hard to do that in any discipline, it seems. And so for such perhaps the most exceptional high dimensionality system, it seems very hard to talk about any micro or macro phenomenon other than the physicality. From a CS person's point of view, it's hard to talk about. We can come up with dumb little models. It seems that logic itself has some problems with it, but I'm just very curious as to what practicing neuroscientists think of this.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think every mental entity has ultimately got to be understood as some, in neural terms, and will be understood in neural terms, except maybe consciousness itself. Given all of this is going on, why do you have a sensation? I don't know that ever can be answered, but at least every mental structure has a neural substrate ultimately, and that's an article of faith, I think.
Yeah, but I would distinguish between has a neural structure, is grounded in the neural structure. That's on one side. The other side is can be understood in terms of that neural structure. So there's a level of understanding. You can't always get more understanding by going to the smaller and smaller parts.
Yeah.
So I think that's a crucial thing to
you
avoid.
work upwards. You work upwards. You get the little guy to explain the next guy and so forth, and then you work. I don't see why this is such a contradiction.
You work downwards too, and sometimes the downwards is better than the upwards.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, I agree. But you have to meet the two ends at some point.
Yeah, I think the point is that you're not going to describe the brain in terms of elementary particles, but it is ultimately made of them. You've got to work at some intermediate level of structure to understand the next level of structure. But we're going to understand structures made out of neurons that correspond to the structures of our minds. Yeah. That's what I believe.
Maybe it's time to throw Penrose in here just briefly, right?
Because
if we're physicalists, and believe that it's all done with matter, still there's distinctions that we haven't made yet, and there are people who try very hard to bring in stuff that we can claim as physical, but we don't. It's so complicated. Quantum mechanical fluctuations in microtubules in neural neurites. Yeah, and so I think all of us believe that's probably wrong, and I think we can understand how it might be wrong just because of all the complexity of these levels that we've already talked about are enough to explain it. But that's an intuition; it's not a proof. So that remains to be seen, but it'll still be physical. I think that there's no argument.
Go ahead. Hi, everyone. First, I want to show that I love what you said today. I'm sorry for the language, but I'm the kind of people who like to formalize life and whatever. Even my speech, for example, this is why I was late tonight, because for example, my husband speaks in such a, let's say, in a linear way, while I speak or think in three-dimensional way somehow. I start and I open a parenthesis and I close, and I remember exactly where I opened it, and then I open another, and so and so. And after the third parenthesis, he says he's bored, but I know that some people is not bored. It depends on which people I'm talking with. And for example, yesterday, 2 days ago.
Is that the new parenthesis, or is that your?
Sorry, this is one of the first parentheses. Sorry. And 2 days ago I was, let's say, bored about some online agendas because I couldn't put inside what I was thinking about. I mean, also because my email address was hacked twice, so I prefer to do something simple. And I started putting some sticky notes on a mirror. Look, okay, let's say the pink one for projects, the blue one for contacts and meetings, like this, the yellow one for all the other stuff on the internet I have to do right now, tons of this, and the green one for something all but the PCs, which means, okay, you have to get up on your chair to get out. And then I start to divide into columns and rows, because I work for databases since 15 years ago. 15 years ago. Yeah. And so in each sticky notes, I put a kind of bullet points. So, I mean, sometimes I realize that my mind is like a database. And that's why I love math, physics. For example, I remember when I studied physics, the first physics, after a while, I stared all what I had all around, because everything happens, it comes from a dynamic law. So even a pen falling down, oh, well, I stared at the pen because that pen was connected with this and this and this. So world is full of math, physics, and whatever. And thank you for letting me understand better.
Thank you.
Sorry about that.
Okay. Thank you.
Oh, I want to tell to the guy who is on Skype or whatever. He told about, I don't know his name, sorry. Anyway, for all of you, he told about computer.
He's still listening.
Computer's behavior
He's just checking
is always the same. Starting from an input, you can have always the same output. Well, this is about, you can say, we can call them deterministic algorithms. But in logic, there are also non-deterministic algorithms, which are like this, something that can happen in different way, even the starting, let's say the starting point are the same, but it's hard to develop in a computer. That's it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I was really interested by the idea how whatever type of unit we're talking about, there may be similar ones across the cortex. I just was doing research in like cross-modal stuff, and so I'm really interested in that. And I guess my question is just, do you think that even though we're talking about reproduction of units in a biological way, it may be just sort of the most efficient way of, growing the brain through time, but there could also be this byproduct which, contributes to our sort of unified experience of the world in the sense that these units are similar and therefore can maybe communicate to each other more easily. And I just wonder if any of you have anything to say about that. I mean, maybe that's confusing.
I didn't quite get it.
Well, just the idea that like whatever unit you're talking about, they are reproduced across the cortex, and does that? I mean, do you know if that has any? Does that have any effect on how easily they communicate to each other, and how something happening in the visual cortex can be referred to something in the auditory cortex, or is it just really, basically that? Anyways, I'll stop. But I thought it was interesting.
I mean, I should just say, there's unity at a lot of levels. There's unity at the, when you look at this 1 millimeter chunk, that it looks, there's a lot of similarity no matter where you are in cortex. But there's also unity in a lot of sort of higher level themes of how the different chunks talk to each other across millimeters, how one area talks to another area and talks back, how they get their input from the thalamus and how they send loops through the basal ganglia. there's a lot of themes that are conserved across at many levels of the hierarchy. So but we're still it's very early days for really figuring out what the hell that's all about.
It might be useful to mention that just the basic mechanisms of communication are pretty much the same. I mean, there's a large number of neurotransmitters that have been identified, but there's a couple of major ones, glutamate and GABA. And those are used all over the brain, so that allows a neurotransmitter to communicate with another one. The other minor transmitters modulate that activity, and they may act differently in different places to help produce the different types of functionality that exists in those different places. But the overall scheme is very much the calcium transmission through ion channels is the same everywhere.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I mean, there's probably 10 kinds of calcium channels, but you know what I mean.
Right.
It's the ion that sends signals. So that facilitates what you're asking about.
Right. I guess just to crystallize, my question is, if you have one unit over here and another unit over here, and they're similarly structured, the brain's whole function is to communicate things to different areas. And so does that, since you guys know so much about this stuff, does that similarity in structure in different areas, does it often facilitate the communication, or is that an unrelated thing? Is it just, I want to hear the frequency and...
I mean, you can. I can sort of say. I mean, there are some theories that if one area is doing something, for example, a famous theory is that if one area is oscillating in a particular rhythm, that it's much better. It has a better chance of communicating with another area that has a similar type of oscillation. So I can say, I don't know if that I'm paraphrasing what you said there correctly or not, but that's so-called binding theory, and there's other things like that. So guys that are similarly firing are more likely to hook up together and communicate.
And there's one other thought I have is just, the big commonality that you see is this 6-layer structure of the cells. And although we don't know exactly what it means, it's clear that sort of different kinds of input enter in different layers with different functions. So so-called feed-forward input comes into layer 4, top-down input tends to come into layer 1. So we don't understand what that's about. But there is a commonality there, which probably means that anybody who sends an input into layer 1 of somebody else, that has a certain meaning, as opposed to sending it into layer 4 of somebody else. So that's maybe along the lines of what you're thinking about.
That helps. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
I just wanted to comment on, since I'm here at the mic. The metaphor is another way that different parts of the brain communicate using this sensory language, like sharp cheese, loud shirt. So you're getting it into play. My comment is about using mathematics for physiology and vice versa. And the question is, when the architecture of the brain starts to tweak a little bit, like in multiple sclerosis, you lose some myelin. In autism, you have shorter connections as opposed to the long connections in the brain. You have more white matter as opposed to gray matter. In dyslexia, you have sort of a neurological junk drawer of cells that aren't aligned. Can you use this in your model to infer what must be going on? In other words, this is not working, and that helps your model to decide what does work.
I think ultimately, yes. You have to sort of know enough. You have to have enough of a model of that particular phenomena that you then can begin to say, well, if I change this variable here, how's that going to change things? So, if you're just completely in the dark, then obviously you're not going to get there yet. But I think in the long run, yes.
Right, but because the small changes give you small behavioral changes, especially with demyelinating.
Well, that's not necessarily true. Small changes don't always. Small changes don't always give you small changes in behavior. I mean, the cortex is parts of it are very tightly balanced, and just small perturbations are enough to kick you into wildly different area, and that's why it's so hard to control it. So, but yeah, I think I agree with Ken, and I think ultimately we're going to be able to use, theory and things to say, like, if what we do, we say, if this happens, then why does this lead to this sort of broader phenomenon? If we wreck this neuron, why do we get this kind of behavior? And that's where theory is very helpful.
Directed initially at Ned, of course anyone else subsequent to that. My question is focused on the importance of the known differences between the predictive, respectively, the predictive and conformational values of a mathematical description of an observed system. Case in point would be Ptolemaic cosmology. It was predictive in terms of the observed motions of stars and planets, but had nothing to do with the physical reality of what was being observed. Fixed shells with planetoids and so on embedded as points of light. More to the context at hand would be the Blue Brain project, where the columnar stack has been modeled mathematically so that there is some allegiance to the input-output signaling, but it says nothing about the physical structure, inherently about the physical structure of the columnar stack. So I wanted to ask Ned and others, is that important to a physicalist such as myself it is, but how important to the value of a robust mathematical theory of the neocortex?
Well, there's a kind of platitudinous answer, which is, this is the Ptolemaic astronomy system is a textbook case of how prediction by curve fitting isn't much use. Prediction is impressive if you do it with a general theory. The Copernican theory had a much better qualitative explanation, even though without adding in all that same extra stuff, it didn't do as well in prediction. So yeah, prediction is really important. It gives you reason to believe that the theory that did the prediction is true, but it's no good if the way you got that whole system was just by sticking in all the data to begin with.
So then where are we at with regards to a mathematical description of neurophysiology in the same capacity? Is it necessary for, and this has been touched on earlier in earlier questions and so on, but how critical is it that at some point, for example, with string theory, we don't know because we don't have the technology to investigate that level of scale just yet, maybe a 14 gig electron.
Look, I think everybody would agree that we're at very early days in neuroscience, and we don't have a lot of the theoretical structure that will allow us to do the kind of explanation we want. We don't even really know what the units are. We don't have explanations of things like pattern recognition. We can do a lot. At certain levels we have a lot of predictive power, but I think we're nowhere near having a satisfactory account.
Yeah, I think there's always sort of a tension between the details of your predictions and sort of the extent to which you're getting the structure of things right. I mean, ultimately what you're looking for is you want to really generalize. You want to predict something that wasn't what you put in to begin with. You want to be capturing a structure that gives you new insight into stuff that wasn't what led you to start thinking about it. And you're never, in neurobiology right now, you're never going to get things quantitatively very precise because there's just too much stuff going on that you're not incorporating while you're trying to capture sort of some basic relationships. And yet you can make a lot of qualitative and to some extent quantitative predictions that you can test and verify. But what you really want is the insight that gives you, that gets the structure right, so that you can generalize to new domains with it.
Go ahead.
From a different standpoint, I wonder if a more humanistic aspect of people can be explained with the models that have been discussed and explained here. For example, affect or emotion, why somebody will react to a particular event with joy, somebody else with sorrow, another person with anger. Can any of this be explained or predicted on the basis either of a statistical mathematical model or a physicalistic model?
Not today, but someday.
Thank you. We will stop.
We'll stop.
Why don't you say those? Certainly.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.